right. So we are focusing on this question. The beginning of the chapter, chapter 2, we said we're going to start talking about the godly soul. And we will talk about the godly soul, chapter 2, chapter 3, and chapter 4. All right. So we will fundamentally try to understand the godly soul. And we'll begin by explaining that the godly soul is a piece of God. Chelek Elokam Imal Mamish, literally a piece of God. And we very strongly, with two different rationales, prove the uniqueness of the godly soul, of the godly soul of a Jew. Exclusively only to a Jew is there a godly soul. And we prove this very, very, very strongly. We prove it so well, so to speak, that now we have a question. And the question we have is, if every Jew has this godly soul, this literal piece of God, the essence core of the godly soul is from the core of God himself. So how is it that we look so different? That we look so different, we don't mean physically, but we look so different spiritually. And then the Rebbe extensively proved that question. And intergenerationally, prior generation looks so much holier. And within a generation, there's the holier Jews, the Jews that are seem much closer to God and much more spiritual and much more connected. And then there's the more average Jews. And then there are Jews that are, so to speak, seemingly far further from God than average. But we're saying that every godly soul is literally a piece of God. The core of the godly soul comes from the core of God. This is literally a piece of God himself. That is the core of every single Jew. So what's going on? This is true, what the Alter Rebbe is saying. We know that's true. But experientially, in terms of our history or understanding, there's definitely levels between people. But how could there be levels if we're all this intense, powerful, shining piece of godliness, the godly soul? So that's what we're now answering. And we're answering it with a parable. And we're in the middle here of explaining this parable. I'm reading, and I will overview what exactly is the parable because it was complicated pieces, and then we'll read inside. So the parable actually is something we mentioned prior in this chapter because we brought in this parable for a different reason earlier in the chapter, which is the development of a child. So page before, we were discussing how every soul is from God, right? Because the verse says the Jew is God's child, God's only child, God's son, God's only son. And just as a child comes from the brain of the father, so too every Jewish soul comes from the brain, so to speak, from the chachma, from the seminal wisdom of God himself. That's what we said last page. Now we're looking at that same metaphor, but we're developing it much more to answer this new question. Again, the question being, if we're all the same, if every godly soul is this unbelievable energy, how is it that Jews look so different and some Jews look so much weaker spiritually than others? So to understand that, let's talk again about the creation of a child, the formation of a child. And the Rebbe will explain that a child starts off as a drop of semen, fertilized, right? You have a fertilized egg. That's a child. Well, the Rebbe says that goes back to the brain of the father. It's actually interesting because through modern science, we actually know that the production of the semen is regulated by the pituitary gland, which is at the base of the brain. So that's the main regulator of the endocrine glands, and one of its jobs is reproduction, formation of the eggs, formation of the semen. So from this gland in the brain of the father comes forth the instructions, what will be the directions to the body to create the semen, right? It will fertilize the egg. That will be invested in the womb of the mother. That will be the very, very, very beginning of what's going to be a human being, what's going to be a child. But in the very beginning, you don't see a child, right? If you scraps of cells, you're not seeing a child. But what happens? Well, that baby develops over 9 months. And over 9 months, that little, tiny little drop, so to speak, form and develop. And first, of course, you're going to have the major organs, the brain, the heart, the lungs, and then more develops, and then more develops, and then more develops. And again, the most significant things are what's developing first. And as time goes on over the 9 months, then you can have other lesser parts and other lesser parts and other lesser parts. And by the time a healthy full-term baby is born, we even have hair and fingernails and toenails. If the baby's a little premature, you probably not gonna have any hair or eyebrows or fingernails or toenails, but that's fine too. If that's all we're missing. As the baby's born earlier than that, there might be other things more critical that have not yet been developed properly. Because over the course of the 9 months, the baby is developing and developing and developing in the womb. And over the 9 months, we're getting even lower, so to speak, in what must happen, and then even lower and then even lower until we actually come to everything: hair, fingernails, toenails. All of those develop from the original drop, that original fertilized egg. That concept, which of course we all know, I didn't say any innovations here, but that concept, the Rebbe is saying, that's the key. It's a parable, it's a metaphor, but it's the key to understand how every one of our souls could be from God himself. And yet we all look so different. So let's look inside. Again, we're in chapter 2. On page 12, the second page of the chapter. And we're in 10 lines from the top, the second word, and we're just about to begin reading this metaphor. Now, this metaphor has 2 parts, but since I just downloaded so much information, I gave you the bulk of the metaphor, which is the first part. There's also a second part. As I read it, we'll see it, and then we'll develop that as well. Kimashal haben, like the metaphor of a child, hanimshach mimo havav, that comes, that's drawn from the brain of his father. As I'm saying, the original regulation that's producing both the eggs in the mother and the sperm in the father is pituitary gland at the base of the brain, the little tiny pea gland, which has many jobs, including reproduction, including that there should be a child that should be born. So from this gland produces the endocrines, produces ultimately the sperm, produces ultimately the fertilization of that egg and what will become that child. That even the toenails, now how are we picking on toenails here? Because we mean what was developmentally so last, and after this, and after this, and after this, and after this, because of course, what has to be developed first is what's most essential for life. And then until you get to things that, are not essential at all, until you get to the toenails. Even the toenails, this well, their original construct, their origin material was this fertilized drop. Every part of the baby comes from that fertilized egg. So this is now a brain, and this is now an eye, and this is an ear, and this is hair, and this is bone, elbow. These are veins, these are sinews, these are cells, skin. All of this came from that fertilized egg. So even when we get to the lowest developmentally aspect of the person, and we're talking about the nails are dead, so to speak. Well, they're alive, but they're dead because you cut them and it doesn't hurt, even though they grow. So low, so far from you and your core. But guess what? Where do they come from? Well, they came from that fertilized egg. It doesn't look anything like a fertilized egg. But where else could it come from? That's the only thing it can come from. There's nothing anything can come from here. So every aspect of the child goes back to a tiny source material in that fertilized egg. That's where everything develops from. Well, it didn't happen overnight. It was through being 9 months in the womb of the mother, and there's development and development and development and development. And this fertilized drop, this fertilized egg, is descending from level to level. Descending meaning starting off in the most specialized, most core aspects of a human, like I said, a brain, heart, lungs. Then we could go to, and I don't know the exact progression, but let's say digestion, hearing, seeing, right? Then we could go lower, then we can have the skin that's going to cover everything. We already have here the bones and the sinews and the veins, and then And then until we can get so far, we can get to things like hair and nails, the last touches. But they're all just evolution from that original drop, which was originally brain matter. There's Thanos, but over those 9 months, over that developmental process, that drop changes incredibly. And from that drop, was originally brain matter, we can even come to being nails, toenails. That was like the first half, the first part one of our answer. And that's what I prepped before. Now let's continue reading to read part two. We'll discuss it and then we'll understand what do these concepts symbolize, which I hope is very obvious. That's the idea. So continuing, part two of the metaphor that I did not tell you yet. And despite this, despite the fact that there's been a tremendous evolution from the original fertilized egg, which goes back to the pituitary gland and the endocrine secretion in the brain, that's a real evolution till you get hair and nails and toenails. But despite all that, despite that long evolution and 9 months worth of development, she is still completely bound up and fused with a wondrous union, in her first existence, in her first establishment. That what was she? What was this soon to be born baby with all of the aspects of a human being? She was originally matter from the brain of the Father. The Gam Achshav Beven. And now in the child, again, this is really the, as I said, second point, second aspect of this metaphor. Yenikas Hatzipernai V'chayusam. The sustenance, the life, the vitality of these toenails. Nimsheches Mehamayach Shabarosh. Is really coming from the brain in the head. So before we read, we prepped our reading by discussing the formation of a child, right? Here's this child starting off at this brain matter, the pituitary gland, determining what's going to be with the endocrines of the body, creating the reproduction, eggs, sperm, from which ultimately comes eggs and sperm, for which ultimately will come a fertilized egg, which will be embedded in the womb of the mother. And then we've all seen the pictures, of course, over 9 months, more and more development of that tiny drop until you have a human being. You have a baby, which might seem like a teensy tiny baby, but compared to that original fertilized egg, wow, what's happened over these 9 months? And then the Rebbe continued and said, and you know what? Even after the child is born, it still has a connection to its origin. Because what's the origin point? The Rebbe is saying, well, the origin point is the brain of the Father. From the brain of the Father, we have this development. We have what will become the semen, what will be this fertilized egg, what will eventually be a human being, a child. And every aspect of that child that's in utero, that's in the womb, is all coming from that fertilized egg, which is coming from the pituitary gland, which is coming from the brain of the Father. And after the child is born, the Rebbe says, there's still a connection between that child and its origin in the brain of the Father. And you're like, what? This child is walking, I don't know, the streets of Jerusalem, parents in Chicago or Brooklyn. I mean, what are you talking about? Two separate human beings or some like beaming energy between the two? What's going on? Well, the Rebbe says no, because everything in a human being goes back to their brain, right? Our brain is the nerve center. Our brain is what's guiding and directing and ultimately fostering every aspect of the human being. And the brain of this, we'll call it child, the brain of the child is really still brain matter going back to the brain of the father. So through the brain of the child, the toenails, we're using the toenails example of like this really farly developed aspect point. And the elbows and the knees and the skin and the toes and the eyes, every aspect of the child is being nurtured by the brain of the child. And the brain of the child is in essence coming from the brain matter of the father. So even when the child is walking around and functioning as an independent person, there's still a connection to his origin through the brain of the child to the original point, the brain of the father. That is the metaphor. Now, a lot of times when we think of metaphors or parables, as you say in Hebrew, Mishalim, we think of like, a prince and a king and maybe a princess, and all that works too. But here we're talking about the formation of a human being, which might have been more familiar to us or felt more like, well, this isn't a story. This is real. It is real. Of course it's real. And the Alter Rebbe is very wisely using this to help us understand the answer to our question. Because if he just gave us the answer, it might be like, what? I don't get that. But I do get this. This is part of my world. I understand this. I say we've all seen the pictures at some point in a doctor's office. Maybe we never studied them so closely, but like we all sort of know what I just said. So yeah, this is true. Okay, well, this makes sense to you. Good. Now take this model, and now we're going to use it to answer our question. So the question was, how do souls, so to speak, look so different? Not that we can see souls, but we see the people who are possessing those souls. So how do souls look so different when we're all one, when it's all the same, when it's all an aspect of the thoughts, the wisdom, the brain of God himself? How high every soul is, literally from the thought of God. How can we all look so different? And how come spiritually some seem so much lower than others? Intergenerationally, within a generation, we're all the thoughts of God, the brain of God. We're all the Son of God. So how is there such difference? This metaphor should give us insight to the answer. So who would like to tell me what they feel the answer is based on this metaphor? Anyone want to try it? We have a question, and our answer was talking about the development of a child. I'm talking about how the child starts off, pituitary gland from the brain of the father, which causes the formation of the semen, which fertilizes the egg, which is implanted in the womb, from which develops all the aspects of the baby, and eventually give it 9 months, even down to the toenails. There's also the second part, but let's just start with, let's focus ourselves. What is this saying in terms of my question of how could souls look so different when we're all from the very thoughts, the very brain matter of God himself?
We are all from the same source, but some of us are nails and some of us are brain and some are hands and so on.
Exactly, Rachel. That simple, that straightforward. Perfect job. All souls start off as the brain of the father, right? My son, my firstborn, Israel. You are sons to God your father. And we said, what are these verses proving? Well, just as a child comes from the brain of the father, the soul comes from the brain, from the thought, from the chachma, from the seminal wisdom of God himself. So every Jewish soul, which is a core definition of the Jew, is a soul. Every Jewish soul is embedded in, emerges from the thoughts, the brain matter, the seminal wisdom of God himself, the highest level of the highest world, Chachma Vatzilus, seminal wisdom of the highest spiritual worlds, from the construct of 4 spiritual worlds, from the world of being. Exactly, Patty. Right? So we have ourselves, right? Coming from God's thoughts. That's the soul of the Jew. Just like every human being, really, if we go back, well, yeah, a human being comes from an egg and sperm. Yeah, but where did the egg and sperm come from? Both the egg and the sperm are really, really sourced in the pituitary gland in the brain. So a child's origin point is the brain of the parent. as the soul's origin point is, so to speak, the brain, the thoughts of God himself. But when that original brain matter, becoming egg and semen, becoming fertilized, being embedded in the womb, well, now that fertilized egg starts changing, because what will be born in 9 months is a human being. But it starts off as what originally was brain, endocrine, gland, brain matter from the parents. So that's the child. The child starts off as brain, becoming this fertilized egg, becoming, with a lot of evolution, a human being. And within the human being, as Rachel said, you could be the eyes, it could be the hands, you could be the toes. Because that tiny drop develops and changes and develops and changes and develops and changes. And the lower, so to speak, that aspect is, the more there is change and change and change and change, until you get from that origin point till nails and hair, till toenails. But if I trace back, it can only be coming from this fertilized egg, from this origin brain matter. That's all there is there. That's all the matter we're dealing with. So too, as Rachel said, every soul starts. I'm sorry, you have a question. Let me just finish this, and then I'll take a question. Okay, I'll pause so you could ask your question. Let me just finish what this metaphor represents, and I'll take your question. So too, and remember, we're in part 1 of the metaphor, and its analysis, as we say in Hebrew, the mashal and the nimshal, the metaphor and its meaning, its analysis. So too, every soul, the godly soul of every Jew, starts off in the brain matter of God himself, seminal wisdom of the world of being, chachma v'tzilas, the highest level of the highest world. And then every soul changes, just as that tiny, tiny fertilized egg develops and develops, grows and develops and changes and develops and grows and changes. The souls change. What does it mean they change? Well, the souls have to leave their origin point of the brain of the Father, of seminal wisdom of the world of being, of chachma v'tzilas, and every soul has to travel. How far does a soul have to travel? It depends. Every soul has a different journey. And as every soul travels, there's changing in that origin point of the brain matter of the Father, of the brain matter, so to speak, of God. The soul started off as a dimension of seminal wisdom of the world of being, of chacham v'tzilas, the brain matter, so to speak, of God. And then has to go through all the dimensions of the world of being. And it's changing, it's leaving its origin point of God's brain matter. And then it has to go to the next spiritual world, the world of Bria, the world of creation, and it has to go through all the levels there. And then it has to go to the next world, the world of Yitzira, the world of formation. And it might have to go through all those levels. And then it might have to go to the next world, the world of action, the world of descent, the world of Asiya, and it might have to go very far down. Now, I keep saying might because every soul has a different journey. Just as, going back to that baby, well, part of that baby is the baby's brain, right? I say baby, we think of baby, it's a human being. We'll say baby. The brain. Well, the brain didn't travel too far to be from the original point of brain to be the brain of the child. And we have those like a highest functioning aspect. We said the heart, the lungs, didn't have to travel so far. And then as there's further development, more, so to speak, traveling. And then further development, more, so to speak, traveling. So if you're comparing the baby's brain to the baby's eyes, to the baby's bone, to the baby's skin, to the baby's hair, to the baby's nails, obviously you understand that everything I just enumerated, and don't ask me to repeat the list, is all had different times needed to develop. Because the lower the function, the more time it took to get from that brain matter to that. And that's what's happening with the souls. Some souls become the eyes. Some souls, exactly as Rachel said, some souls are the eyes, some souls are the hands, some souls are the ears, some souls are the skin, some souls are the brain matter, some souls are the hair, some souls are the nails, some souls are the toenails. And depending on where that soul is in the evolutionary chain, the development, that's how long it travels. Because just as by the baby, the lowest functioning is going to emerge last. It needs the most time to change. So too by the soul. The highest souls travel the least. They're changing the least. And then another soul's going to travel a bit more and change a bit more, be a bit lower. And then another soul's going to change much more, travel much more, be much lower, and until you could envision the soul that travels all the way to the end of that, right? There's 4 spiritual worlds. Each world has, if we subdivide it, 900 some levels. So imagine the soul traveling almost 3,600 levels. How far does that soul look from its origin point? But that soul, like the soul of the greatest, holiest Jew of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Solomon, every soul starts off highest level, highest world. Chachma Vatzila, seminal wisdom of the world of being. But some souls develop, travel, are affected by the descent much, much more than others. What was your question?
Well, I like the last part of what you're talking about. I probably need to digest that a little bit more. But going back to your previous point about a lot of the development stemming from the father's thoughts, the only questions I have is, one, everyone has an X chromosome, but not everyone has a Y chromosome. And the Y chromosome determines.
You know what? It's a little hard for me to hear you. Can you, I know you're talking to a phone. Can you speak up a little more? Just to make sure it's a little more clear for me to hear.
Yeah, so I'm just, the question is, how do we know it's the male brain?
That's an excellent question. You know what's so interesting? I've taught this chapter many times. I've been in this class, doing this class since 1991. And I taught Tanya in other forums as well. And I believe tonight I was feeling so strongly that question, intently, more than I've ever felt it when I've ever taught this, ever. And maybe I was picking up your vibes, or maybe you were picking up my vibes. But I was literally, that was pounding in my head. Like I was so sure I was going to hear from someone because it was so intense. So maybe you had very strong mental vibes that I was picking up, or maybe it was reversed, and maybe it was from my brain to yours. Excellent question. Basically, the question, which is a very obvious question, and I was thinking it a lot as I was saying it, but is literally, and I am not exaggerating, I cannot tell you how many times I've taught chapter 2 of Tanya. I believe it's like the first time it ever crossed my mind. So one of us. Everything the Alter Rebbe said, you could turn around, not turn around, it's not really a turnaround. You could just say, well, why do we keep saying the brain of the father? I mean, it's also true the brain of the mother. And it is true. And I actually did look this up tonight, because sometimes I do try to prepare a bit. And I did look up the pituitary gland because I did want to make sure what I was saying was accurate. And this is what I always knew. As I said, I've taught this many times, but I did see, and yes, it does say there very clearly, it's, the regulating both the production of the sperm and the egg, obviously depending if this is, male or female. So really everything the Rebbe said, which is 100% accurate and true, we could just say goes back from the brain of the child to the brain of the mother, to the brain of the father, to both brains. And that's 100% true, 100% true in the reality that we're talking about, which is understanding the formation and descent and transformation of the soul. You don't have 2 parents. It's God. It's the brain of God who we're referring to as the Father. Now, of course, in essence, we could also refer to God as the ultimate mother. God is our everything. We have so many different verses describing so many different relationships between us and God. God is our spouse, right? We're the wife and God is the husband. We're the child and God is the father. So because all of this is to give us the understanding of the development of the soul. This is not a biology class, or, this is a class on understanding our souls. We're using the term the brain of the father. But if we're looking at the biology of it, yes, it's 100% the brain of the father, and it's 100% the brain of the mother. And we could use either one. But for us, more naturally, we would say the father. And that's why we keep going back to the father. But absolutely right, 100% correct. If we were focusing only on the metaphor, but here we're using the words of the metaphor to most accurately depict the soul's journey. And that's why we say the brain of the father, referring to seminal wisdom of God, the father. But great question. One of us had a great question. I don't know if it was me or you. One of us had a very good question. So this was our question, right? I mean, the Alter Rebbe said it. We could say the Alter Rebbe's question, but the Alter Rebbe is really, so to speak, elucidating what would be a very logical question and saying, wait a minute. Again, in the beginning of the chapter, I proved to you that the soul is like nothing else of creation. Unlike an angel, unlike your cell phone, unlike a celestial being higher than an angel, unlike a spiritual world, unlike anything. Because all of creation, if you remember, is speech, and the soul is breath. All of creation is from the speech of God. The soul is from the brain matter of God, the thoughts of God. We are God's child. We come from his brain. Well, if we all come from his brain, which again, in the technical Kabbalistic term means seminal wisdom of the world of being, Chachma Batzilos, why do we look so different? We should all look the same, enormous godly beings. Because, as we're now learning, unpacking this metaphor, every single soul of every single Jew travels. Most souls travel quite a bit. I said before, there are 4 spiritual worlds. Very few souls emerge from that highest world, the world of being. That's like an Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Aaron, David, Solomon type of soul. Most souls have to travel past that whole reality to come into the next world, the world of Bria, the world of creation. Now, every step, and I said there's 900 steps per world, every step means a constriction of the soul's energies, and another constriction, and another constriction. So imagine the constriction of those first 900 steps. And then we come into the world of creation, the world of Bria. And some souls emerge from that world of Bria, from the world of creation. And those are very high souls. Those are generally the souls of, we call tzaddikim, the pure, holy, righteous, godly people, that their whole being is God. Their whole focus is God. Their whole reality is God. The whole reason for existence is God. And most souls don't stop their journey somewhere in the world of Bria, in the world of creation, and descend to the next world, the world of Yetzirah, the world of formation. And in the world of formation, again, there are many, 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 many levels. Again, some 900 levels. So some soul might stop very high, and some soul might travel much further, and some soul might go all through to the very end of that world. And some souls, their journey isn't over, and they go through that entire world, and they have to go to the next world, that final of the 4 spiritual worlds, the world of descent, the world of action, the world of Asiya. And even in that world, we got, again, 900 levels. And imagine step by step by step, the soul's journeying and getting more covered over. And her power is more concealed and more concealed. Again, remember that brain matter becoming a toenail, a piece of God's wisdom, seminal wisdom of the world of being, emerging somewhere, somewhere in the lower levels of this lowest world, the world of descent. And every step affects. But the core never changes. The core never changes. And even the soul, as we're going to read, not today clearly, but even the soul that goes through all the 3,600 levels, that comes out in the lowest level of the lowest world, in her core, she's from seminal wisdom of the world as being. She's from Chachmat Silas. I think of those Russian stacking dolls, right? So let's say, to understand this metaphorically, You know how you have each inner doll is more and more precious. So let's say this is a very expensive Russian stacking doll set. So that inner core doll is platinum, then covered over by a doll of gold, covered over by a doll of silver, covered over by a doll of copper, covered over by a doll of brass. So I'm seeing the brass. But if I uncover the brass, within that brass is the copper. And within that copper is beautiful silver. And within that silver is the gold. And within that gold is the platinum. And no matter that on the surface you see brass, that doll is carrying around as her inner existence, that platinum. Never got destroyed. It got covered over. The soul's reality is never destroyed. Every single soul comes from seminal wisdom of the world of being, from Chacham Atzilus, from the thoughts of God himself, from the brain of the Father. Every soul, no matter what the person looks like, every soul comes from seminal wisdom of the world of being, from the brain, from the thoughts of God. But there's coverings and coverings and coverings. But wherever we are, we can uncover and access our origin. Obviously, with work. But it's always possible because your origin is always inside of you. What the Rebbe said in the second half, much briefer, but very strong point, that in essence, you could say is not really relevant. Like, why add on to the storyline? I had a question. If all souls are for the brain of the Father, seminal wisdom of God, why is it that we all look so different? I gave a beautiful answer. I gave a beautiful metaphor for my mind to understand it, and Rachel answered the question beautifully. So obviously it's very clear. And then we unpacked it, very clear. But the Rebbe didn't stop. The Rebbe added seemingly not necessary information, not needed to answer my question, but needed for my general gestalt, my total perspective and understanding of self and of God and of our relationship, and of the very core new concept the Rebbe brings in here. What does the Rebbe say? And after this child is born, or in utero, or when the child is born, or when the child is 60 years old, the child is still connected to the origin point. Child, a human being, separate, walking around, no longer in the womb of the mother anymore, you know? That child, with its fingers and its toes and its eyes and its ears, it all started off as brain matter. And it's all being fed by the brain of that person, what we would call the brain of the child. And that brain matter is really back to the origin point. Brain of the Father, brain of the child. Stayed brain. It's that rare aspect, that stayed brain. Brain of the Father, brain of the parent, brain of the child. So the body, the human being, is being nurtured by brain of the child. But the brain of the child is really one with the brain of the parent. So no matter where that person is and what's happening to them, they still have a connection to their origin, to the brain of their parent, as we're saying here, the brain of the Father. And what the Rebbe means here is that all of our souls start off as brain matter, but our souls traveled, as we explained. And every soul was given a different destination, a different triptych, a different journey. And the longer the journey, the more covering over and covering over and covering over, like till we get our bones, our sinews, our joints, our veins, our arteries, our skin, our hair, our nails. But no matter how far you travel, you still have a connection to brain, because that's what's feeding all of you. The whole body is coming from brain. And that brain is still connected to the origin brain, the brain of the Father, the brain of the parent. Every single soul travels, but every single soul is still connected to its origin point. The brain of the Father, God's existence, seminal wisdom of the world of being, Chacham Atzilus, through the brain of the child, through those souls that still maintain their existence as brain matter. Those souls that didn't really journey from their origin, those highest, highest, highest souls. When we say Rebbe, Rebbe is actually an acronym for 3 Hebrew words. It's 3 Hebrew letters. In English, it's like 5 letters, but in Hebrew, it's 3. And those 3 Hebrew letters stand for 3 Hebrew words, Rosh B'nai Yisrael, the head of the Jewish people. Very specifically, we're saying head because the function of that highest soul is to be that brain. The brain is still brain matter. That soul didn't really deviate from its origin point. So the brain of the son, the soul of these highest tzaddikim, most godly people, still are connected to the brain of the Father, still are connected to God in our origin point. And through them, every other part of the body of the Jewish people, every other Jew, through the brain of the Son to the brain of the Father, through the tzaddik, through this most holy, godly Jew who didn't really move from his origin point of brain matter, back to God, back to all of our origin point. And that's why these tzaddikim, these holy, holy, holy Jews who have this function of feeding, of nurturing, of connecting all the Jews to God, they're called, Kabbalistically, Memutza HaMachaber, the intermediary that connects, that they are an intermediary being part of the Jewish people and being so much God matter that they can fuse the two and reconnect the body of the Son back to the origin point, the brain of the Father, the souls of the Jews that traveled back to their origin point, the thoughts of God Himself. Okay, I said a lot. Any questions?
Sorry, I hope you don't mind. I might have a few comments.
Yes, and I was just now wanting to read them. Actually, I just opened up my chats to see.
I get very excited about this subject, so
I see. Yes, that's interesting. I just read your comments, and yes, that is very interesting. That point of from man to woman, from Adam to Eve, from Adam to Chava. Yes, that is true. That is a very interesting point. Anyone else? Any thoughts? Any questions? Any comments?
I just kind of felt with your deep description of the human being and the origin and how how like it all comes from the source and it's all one human being, but it kind of made me feel like a deeper understanding of Avos Yisrael, because if you see like if you see that mashal, that metaphor as it's one body, like no parent would say, well, I don't want this part of the child or that, like it's all one body. So if you look at it but you always think of the Jews as one body, but it's because you described it in such detail, I felt it stronger. Like if you look at the whole baby and it's all beautiful and all perfect, then we are all that together. Like it just felt like more vivid by the way you described it.
Wow, that's beautiful. That is beautiful. That's a beautiful, not surprising for Frumma takeaway from this concept. You're right. We are all from the same origin and we are one. We are together that body of Klal Yisrael. Every one of us with that beauty. Every part of the baby is beautiful. Not only the beautiful eyes, every part of the baby is beautiful. We're all part of that beautiful child called Klal Yisrael, B'ni B'chayri Yisrael, my child, my firstborn, the Jewish people. Absolutely, it's beautiful. Anyone else? Any other thoughts or questions?
Cyril?
Yes, Rachel.
But in relation to the child, what does it mean after child is born? his brain is connected to the brain of his father.
But in the metaphor or in the soul, like in the
In the
muscle,
metaphor. In the metaphor.
in the metaphor,
Yeah.
what it means is that the brain of the child, and as was said before, yes, if we were saying completely the metaphor and not focusing on the representation of the souls, we could say the brain of both parents, and that's 100% correct. Of all parts of self, self meaning me, meaning you, a human being, that part that's most closest to our origin matter is our brain. Because if we're understanding that the first conception of the child really originates in brain, the brain of the parents. So the first development of a child, that human being, the first thing that's going to emerge is brain. And that brain doesn't have to really shift and develop. Like, why does it come first? Because that's what originally it was. So it doesn't have to travel, doesn't have to move to become from a brain to become something else, because that's what it is. It's brain. So in the child, in the what will be the baby, in the fetus, that brain matter, that's the closest to the origin that emerged from the parents. That's that closest point, which then develops and develops and develops and develops and develops, as I said at length many times probably tonight. So when that child is born, I mean, this child is, 58 years old. So, but still, as a human being, that part of me that we could almost call biologically, but maybe it's more like spiritually biologically, mystically biologically, most closest to my origin in my parents is my brain, because that was the origin point from which everything else emerged. So it doesn't mean, again, in the story, a human being's development as versus in the soul, where it actually does mean it very literally. As us as human beings, it's not that wherever I am, there's this line of connection, this line of nurturance from my parents' brain to my brain to me. But in what this represents, it actually does mean that. But in the human manifestation of that, and of course, every parable, every metaphor we use always has some limitations. It's only a metaphor. So obviously that is a limitation here, but there's still a point that we could assimilate and say, that's interesting. I thought I had my father's eyes. I thought I had my mother's nose. I never thought of like having my parents' brain, her ears, her cheekbones, her bone structure, her skin color. But the Rebbe is saying what you have the most is the brain. That changed the least from any part of you from its origin point. And because that changed the least, your brain most closely connects you to your origin point in your parents' brain. In the representation and what all that represents, the truth that we're trying to understand, what all this symbolizes, those souls that are still like the brain of the father, because they traveled so minimally from their origin point of seminal wisdom of the world of being, of Chachma Batzilus, because they're so holy, they're still connected to that origin point. They're still brain matter, God brain matter. They're so minimally covered, they so minimally traveled. So those tzaddikim, and again, I'm not minimizing any tzaddik, any very, very righteous, holy, godly person, but the highest ones, like we say in every generation, there's that one Jew who we refer to as the verse is in Mishlei, Tzaddik Yisod Olam, that most righteous, holiest Jew who is the foundation of the world, one per generation. There's only one in any lifetime. There's one. So that soul is brain matter. Well, it's brain matter of the son, it's the soul. But brain matter of the son is brain matter of the father. So he's still connected to brain matter. And through that tzaddik's connection to brain matter, every single soul, through that soul, is connected to our origin, to brain matter. So the souls of all of the Jewish people, through our brain, because we all form one body, through most specifically that tzaddik, that Jew who's still brain matter, we are fed and nurtured to our connection to the origin, to the brain matter of our origin of God himself. It's very interesting. After the passing of the previous Rebbe, sure, before, it took about a year, not about, it took a year from the previous Rebbe's passing and the Rebbe's accepting the leadership from 1950 to 1951, the 10th of Shvat 1950 to the 10th of Shvat 1951. And during that year, many people tried to convince, so to speak, Lubavitcher Rebbe, the current Lubavitcher Rebbe, to take on leadership. And he refused many times. And this was more towards beginning. This was actually a letter the Rebbe wrote on the 3rd of Tammuz. So that's like, let's say, June, July time. 3rd of Tammuz. A response to someone, or actually no, who wrote to the Rebbe what's called a Tzad Hiskashrus. He wrote to the Rebbe a letter accepting the Rebbe as his Rebbe, as the leader of the Jewish people, as we would say, the brain of the sun. And the Rebbe wrote back a letter dated Gimel Tammuz, very interesting, 3rd of Tammuz of 1950, Tafshin Yud. And the Rebbe there said, like, so to speak, I'm saying in my own words, you think I'm Rebbe? Do you know what a Rebbe is? What do you think a Rebbe is? Is a Rebbe a very wise person? A Rebbe very, very learned in all of Torah? A Rebbe is a miracle worker? He can be a miracle worker. He can be very wise. He can be very righteous. This doesn't make you a Rebbe. A Rebbe means that channel of God's energy to the Jewish people. So, like, don't tell me I'm the Rebbe. No, obviously he was the Rebbe. But it's a very interesting letter where the Rebbe is, in essence, in other words, saying what the Alter Rebbe is saying here in chapter 2 of Tanya. That brain of the child is the conduit of energy from the brain of the father to the body of all the souls of the Jewish people. Because the brain is still connected to the brain. So through our connection to our brain, we're connected to where our brain is connected with, to the origin point, to the brain of the Father. The Jewish people, through the Rebbe, receiving the vitality from God, brain of Father, brain of child, all the souls, the body of the Jewish people. That's a very, very, very powerful thought. Anyone else? Any other questions? Any other thoughts on this?